The Branch Covidians and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer on the other side of the camera, not the channel, the camera. Welcome, everybody. This is Mark Fisher of Mark and the Millennials, and we're calling this podcast The Branch Covidians, a great article today in the Daily Caller titled Just That. And we will read it because it's pretty epic and it's well done. But before we go there, we have a bunch of things to discuss today. And one of them is about Texas Hispanics, how they're running away from the Democrat Party because of the trans movement for kids, and the Hispanics want nothing to do with it. And they're running away from the Democrat Party, Hispanics are, because of inflation. Go figure, they actually care about that too. And sarcasm intended. But before we talk about those particular issues, podcast listeners, we have to make you laugh a little bit because we talked about this the other day, aka debating Fetterman. And we did that, and we'd like to call him Shrek, because of the fact that he reminds us of Young Frankenstein, the movie. But we're going to remind you of that because we just think it's fun today since we're getting closer to the election and everybody's really getting tired of this election stuff. And they just want it to be over so that we can save our country. We thought it's an opportunity to make you laugh at the very outset of Mark and the Millennials. So here is a quick little segment of the debate with Dr. Oz and Fetterman in Pennsylvania. Again, here it is.
I do support fracking, and I support fracking, and I stand.
I support fracking, and I stand. I do support fracking. And then, of course, we think good old Fetterman reminds us of Young Frankenstein in the movie Young Frankenstein, where he's on stage and dancing so that he looks less imposing. And we have that clip. We have to play it. Tell me this doesn't sound like Fetterman. Listen.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits?
Putting on the Ritz. Okay, so let's play Fetterman's thing one more time. The Fetterman thing. Listen.
I do support fracking, and I support fracking, and I stand.
Okay, you have to admit that is funny. All right, because what party in their right mind, what major party of the most important country in the world would put forth in one of the most important states in the country a Senate candidate that can't even speak or even process words? And it seems like he's having difficulty in a lot of different areas. And so it would be the Democrat Party, because this is kind of what they've done nationwide. They either don't want to debate because they can't process common sense, or they just choose to debate after early voting has started. Speaking of which, podcast listeners, early voting has started, and I have a great story for you about early voting in my home county, and I think that you probably have had similar experiences. If you haven't, you should try having this conversation. So get this. At each early voting polling station, there is typically a Democrat tent and a Republican tent. Under the Democrat tent, there's a table with all of the literature of the Democrat candidates. Same thing under the Republican tent. And there are also people under the Democrat tent, individuals who are working the tent, people under the Republican tent who are working the tent. That is to say, if you want to learn more about candidates or have a conversation, you walk over there, you have a conversation. So I visited early voting a number of times, and my first thought process was, and I mentioned this to Christopher Hopkins, our producer, I mentioned this: who in their right mind today in 2022 would want to work under the Democrat tent at early voting? Who would even want to be seen under that tent, knowing what we know about what the Democrat Party is promoting nationwide and how they are running the country into the ground? Who would want to work there? So here's an example. what I've noticed is, because in my county, we have 3 early voting centers. At each of the early voting centers, it tends to be middle-aged women or older, but almost exclusively women. And they tend to be single. And quite frankly, they tend to be really angry looking. Now, you might say, Mark, that's a generalization. Well, I tested my theory. I walked over and I started speaking with them. So at one of the early voting centers, I walked over and I started talking to them. And do you know, out of all of the things that could come out of their mouths after I said, hi, how are you doing today? My name's Mark Fisher. Reached out my hand to shake their hands. And naturally, most of them didn't want to shake my hand because that's the Democrat way these days. They immediately started with this insurrection January 6th stuff. It's incredible. It's like there's a mental illness in the Democrat Party that they want to talk about January 6th and insurrection. And meanwhile, people can't afford to, of course, buy food and gasoline. And there isn't enough diesel oil. There's a baby formula shortage. Pretty remarkable, right? So I actually went to another early voting center, exact same situation. And then a friend of mine who's running for office, she told me, and this friend is a Republican, she told me that one of the same individuals came over to her when I wasn't there and said to this candidate who's a Republican, so it was woman to woman having a conversation, Democrat woman to Republican woman, and the Democrat woman was saying, you know, I heard that you were part of the insurrection and you went and broke into the Capitol, or that you were in the city. And it was just the most remarkable thing, because this lady that I know who's running as a Republican for an office, she just looked at the Democrat and she says, you know, it's just amazing to me that rather than first saying hello, your only concern is about something that happened a couple of years ago. And are you at all concerned about voter ID? Are you at all concerned about, drop boxes? Are you at all concerned about the economy? I mean, and the lady just couldn't respond because I actually do believe this. I think there is a serious mental illness now in the Democrat Party. It's a very sick party. And so, yes, early voting is open. And if you want to test this theory, test it yourself. Go over and introduce yourself to the Democrat table. Now, if you're not a candidate, they're going to think that you're actually there to learn more about the Democrat candidates for the sole purpose of perhaps voting for them. But that's fine. Just go over and start talking to them. And then just start talking about issues. But do it in an intelligent and straightforward way by saying to them, so do you think it's okay for the government to spend so much money that it causes inflation so that people can't afford to buy stuff? And see what they say. Do you think it's okay to make people poorer so they can't afford to go to work because they can't buy gasoline? I mean, just go right down the list. Do you think it's okay for children to transition into another sex, which you can't transition into another sex, but to have puberty blockers and other things, and see what they say? Just go down the list. Go down the list and ask these individuals that question. And I think what you're going to find out under the Democrat tent is that they're going to get very upset with you, and they're just angry. They're just incredibly angry people. I don't understand why they're not happy people, because their party controls the House and the Senate and the presidency. Why wouldn't they be happy? But they're still angry. How can you still be angry if you're like a hyper-political person? And that's all that matters to you, let's say. And your party is in charge of both houses of Congress and the presidency so that you can pass anything you want. How can you still be angry at the world? And yet they are. Completely and utterly upset and angry. And I'm not even sure they even know why, but they are unhappy. I think that's really clear. So, speaking of the election podcast listeners, there is an election going on in New Hampshire for United States Senate. And the current sitting senator is a Democrat. Her name is Maggie Hassan. And everybody thought months ago that this would be the one Senate seat that would be very safe. Because even though New Hampshire is somewhat of a swing state, I mean, clearly it's lately been trending more Democrat, I think, but people who live in New Hampshire tend to be very independent-minded, which is a good thing, okay? They're critical thinkers. But the Democrat Party thought that Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire as the sitting Democrat senator would be safe because she's articulate and is able to, and she's a woman, and New Hampshire is a safe state, so no reason to worry whatsoever. However, they need to worry now because just today, her opponent is now leading her in New Hampshire 5 days before the general election. So Republican senatorial candidate Dan Bolduc, who is running against Democrat incumbent Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, has gained a new boost in the polls 5 days before the general election, according to Trafalgar Group and Daily Wire survey published Thursday. Bolduc, a retired brigadier general, now has the support of 47% of New Hampshire voters, 1.3 points over Hassan's 45.7%, according to the Trafalgar Group, which conducted the survey for the Daily Wire. Interesting, huh? The Daily Wire actually paid for a survey to be done, a poll in New Hampshire. Though the poll is within the margin of error and a statistical tie, it would be enough to win the seat and a greater margin of victory than Hassan's in her 2016 win against Republican then-Senator Kelly Ayotte by more than 0.14 points. So Hassan barely won, of course, 6 years ago. However, today, she is in a statistical tie, even though it's showing that Bolduc is slightly ahead because, of course, the margin of error. But the point, of course, the takeaway here is that this is a seat the Democrats thought would be kind of an easy win because, for one, they had a very good candidate, a sitting senator, and two, they just thought that the Republicans would focus only on Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Ohio, Arizona, and Georgia. But the Republicans across the country have been focusing on almost every state because there are so many now competitive United States Senate and U.S. congressional districts. So Bolduc's new lead in the final moments of the race marks a dramatic reversal of polling dynamics. As early as September, Hassan was telegraphed as having a 10-point lead in the race, with Bolduc having made up the gap across all major polls per the Real Clear Politics poll, which shows the average lead for Hassan being just 0.5 points, a half a point. And so Hassan, a former governor of New Hampshire, is considered one of the most vulnerable incumbents, even though she's a sitting senator, former governor, so she's really, really well known, during this year's midterm elections. But the thing is, you never read about that. All we heard about in the media is it was Georgia, it was Wisconsin, it was Pennsylvania, it was Ohio, and it was Arizona. And then recently, a few months ago, they added in Adam Laxalt, in Nevada. But never did you really hear about New Hampshire because the media always wanted to make you think that it was never in play. So Bolduc emerged as the GOP nominee despite opposition from Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. So McConnell didn't even want to support him. And McConnell's super PAC, the Senate Leadership Fund, backed the state Senate president, Chuck Morse, in the race. However, he has since received McConnell's support. So now McConnell's like, well, now that I think you're going to win, I'm going to support you. Kind of interesting, huh? how the voters want newcomers. They want people who aren't affiliated with the same old rot in either party. And certainly in the Republican Party, that's the case. You have a lot of new energy, a lot of new candidates, a lot of really bright candidates. I know we've talked about Blake Masters before in Arizona, high-tech guy, smart guy, successful in the private sector, self-made, and new, never run before. And then, of course, in Ohio, J.D. Vance, same thing. Grew up poor, dirt poor, in fact, self-made, really, had an average education system that he could go to because he went to public school, only to make sure that he studied at home and worked really hard and then worked his way into Yale. I think Yale Law School is, I believe, where he ended up going, and then was successful in business and never run before for politics, but understands tech. These are all new faces. These are the faces that we need now, I think, in the United States, not even just the Republican Party, but just the United States, not political hacks who've been in office forever. I mean, it's just really refreshing to see these new folks. So now you got this guy in Bolduc in New Hampshire who actually might win. And that is a state the media, as I said, never talked about. It was never in play. And now suddenly the media is saying, oh, well, she was always vulnerable. I don't think so. I never read about that. And I read this stuff all the time. Never once did they talk about Maggie Hassan. I was like, oh, that's just a foregone conclusion. She's going to win again. So kind of interesting move there. And we're hoping that good old Bolduc actually wins because he's not part of the swamp of D.C. He was not supported by Mitch McConnell, and he's new, and he has experience, and he brings a different perspective to the United States Congress and to the Republican Party. So next up, podcast listeners, voter ID does not work for the trans community. I thought I've heard everything. I thought I heard everything. So, transgender activists cry foul on voter ID. Can't make this up. Before the 2022 midterm elections, transgender activists worry that voter ID laws, which require citizens to show state-issued identification cards, like your driver's license, pretty straightforward, in order to be able to cast a ballot. Trans activists believe it will force them to associate with their birth names and biological sex. Oh, gosh. The complaint from far-left ideologues, though complex in its jargon, comes down to a simple point. People who drastically alter their appearance, change their names, and choose new pronouns often face difficulties in proving their legal identity. Imagine that. Imagine that. You change your name and you change the way you look and you do everything you can to make everybody else as confused as you certainly appear. And then you're shocked that people don't and can't identify you when you try to vote or, try to cash a check. Henry Seaton, a female, Henry, okay, who presents herself as a male, said she faced this discrimination when she tried to vote at a church outside of Nashville, Tennessee in 2016, NBC News reported. Of course, naturally, she tried to vote in a church. Seaton changed her legal name to Henry, but the government-issued ID still correctly identified her as a female, because she still is a female. The poll workers felt understandable confusion and asked Henry to explain the situation. Quote, I had to out myself as transgender, said Seaton. Can you imagine? I had to out myself as transgender. I'm pretty sure people can tell. Okay. I mean, right, Chris? Can't you tell? You know?
Depends.
Yeah, I mean, like Saturday Night Live used to have Pat on there, and Pat was always like, you could never tell, whether Pat was a guy or a girl. Of course, Saturday Night Live could never do that now. But, quote, I had to out myself as transgender, said Seaton, a 24-year-old transgender justice advocate at the American Civil Liberties Union of Tennessee. So this is now part of justice, right? Being able to vote and confusing the folks working the polls because all they're trying to do is to verify your identity. And somehow they're the bad people. People who suffer from gender dysphoria, like Seaton, report experiencing anxiety and trauma when forced to reveal their legal name and sex. Seaton said revealing himself to be a male, well, Seaton, of course, is a girl, is a female, and revealing herself to be a male, although I'm just reading the article the way they have it written, can be brutally dangerous, especially where I was living, which is a conservative suburb. Of course, by the way, it's your choice to live in that conservative suburb, okay? No one's making you live there. But naturally, if you're an activist, which this individual is, for the American Civil Liberties Union, and you live in a conservative suburb of Tennessee, which is probably very likely, it's in Tennessee, that's going to be conservative, you shouldn't be really surprised. So, of course, Seaton never claimed that anyone actually threatened him. So there you go. No one threatened the guy. All they were doing is just asking questions. When Henry went to the polls and tried to vote, and they asked Henry what for his ID, and Henry shows his ID, and the ID says, well, Henry is a woman. And so the poll watchers and the folks that are working there were like, well, then can you explain this? Because you don't necessarily look like the picture, and the sex thing looks like it's a little off. It's, quote, just not embarrassing, but it's terrifying to have to do that, to try to read the room and see, like, are they going to kick me out? It can be dehumanizing to have your whole identity nitpicked just so that you can cast your ballot and have your voice be heard, he said. The left has decided to put transgender people alongside poor and black people who now claim they cannot access voter IDs. So, how you like that? So in the Maryland House of Delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I served on a committee for 4 years called the Ways and Means Committee. And one of the things that it covered, and still does, is election laws. How do you make elections better? Since the Democrats control the legislature, they always make elections less secure because that's what Democrats do, and that is a fact. We have heard in that committee, and I heard in that committee, so many bills about voter ID, making voter ID compulsory, making it the law of the state. And invariably, we would have people come up and testify who would say, and it was hard to believe they could do it with a straight face. They would testify and say, well, black and brown people can't get IDs, and therefore voter ID is discriminating. I kid you not. And so then we would have folks from the state's election board present because they would always show up and watch the hearings since it would obviously impact their responsibilities in running elections. And I remember asking them in committee, isn't it so that in Maryland, if you can't afford to purchase an ID, the state will pay for the ID and provide it to you for free? And the answer was, yeah, we do that all the time. So once again, if you cannot drive because you don't have a car or you can't afford to drive, and therefore you don't have a driver's license, the state will issue an ID that looks just like the driver's license, but it's just not a permission to drive. But it looks the exact same way. It's the same size and everything. I think that's $25 or thereabouts. And if you still can't afford that, the state will provide it to you for free because The idea is, well, you need to probably go cash your checks from the various welfare agencies. You may have food stamps. You may need an ID for all kinds of reasons. Duh, of course you do. And so the left always would come to the Ways and Means Committee and say, nope, voter ID discriminates against black and brown people. And now the left has found a brand new way to fight voter ID. Well, trans people shouldn't be required to show their voter ID because it discriminates against trans people. In other words, voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people. Fancy words, right? Disproportionately impact. And we've also heard the same thing about folks who are homeless. I've actually heard testimony from folks who work in homeless communities. They are not themselves homeless, but they work in homeless shelters. And they say, well, ID laws are wrong because homeless people can't vote. Can you imagine? Once again, the state will provide an ID for you for free. But many of these individuals could care less about voting. I'm talking about the homeless. And I'm sure some do, but they can get that ID for free. And the fact of the matter is, the Democrats are just shameless when they talk about this issue. And now they're using the trans issue. In my state, ladies and gentlemen, and this has happened in other blue states, in my state, you can go change your birth certificate retroactively. Think about that. You can identify as another sex. Of course, I'm sure the Democrats would love it, because that's probably coming next, by the way. Not that you just change your sex from male to female or female to male, but that there's a third choice, right? And that might actually be the law now. I'm not really sure. I have to really look that up if there's an other, because it wouldn't surprise me. But already in my state and in many blue states, it is already the law that you can change your birth certificate. Now, the left, I think they were probably playing the long game. And the long game was, you know what, why don't we do this with this whole trans thing to try to make it impossible to verify elections? Because before it was black and brown, and that's obviously getting really stupid sounding now. You know, black and brown people can't afford to have an ID, and therefore they should not be forced to bring it because it requires too much work to bring your ID when you go vote. And they don't want you to vote in person, and we all know why that is. So to prove this point, ladies and gentlemen, we have a clip from NBC. All right, and NBC, you have the two anchors in the morning talking about how voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people. And we have this clip, and it's just shameless. And here's the clip.
Voters are concerned they might be blocked from casting their ballots.
Yeah, that's because a growing number of states are enforcing stricter voter identification laws that disproportionately impact the community.
NBC Out reporter Joe Yerkeba joins us now with more on this. Joe, good morning to you. So first of all, how can voter ID laws create obstacles for transgender people? And where do we see some of the strictest voter ID laws?
Sure, yeah. So voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people because trans people are more likely to have IDs without the name that they go by and the gender marker that reflects how they present. And recent research shows that just over 200,000 eligible trans voters in 31 states that both conduct their elections mostly in person and require or request ID at the polls don't have IDs that reflect their gender identities and the names they go by. And, you know, the states that have the strictest voter ID laws are mostly concentrated in the South and Midwest. So Tennessee, Wisconsin, Kansas. So voters there are going to be.
So NBC News, a major news outlet saying voter ID is bad because trans people should not be required to provide their voter ID. And we have the most extreme versions of voter ID laws in, of course, those Republican states. So here's an idea, ladies and gentlemen. Here's a great compromise, which, by the way, I will ask you to ask yourself, do you think Democrats would ever go for this? So hear me out on this voter ID stuff. I have a Mac laptop, which I love. Okay, I love Mac products. Let's face it, the stuff works really well. I don't get very many viruses. And the reason I like my Mac laptop as well is because there's a fingerprint option on here. And you just put your fingerprint on the Mac, and the Mac, of course, opens to your apps and remembers your gazillion passwords that you have for all the different things that you need to access. So if a trans activist doesn't want to use their ID, then why don't we have the same kind of fingerprint scanning at the polls? You walk up and they say, "Name, sir," or maybe they're afraid of saying "sir" because of, name. Just name now. Name. And the person gives their name, your address. And the person gives their address. Great. Now, would you like to show your ID, or would you like for us to scan your fingerprint? Now, I have no problem showing my ID. Between you and me, I'd prefer not to have my fingerprint out there, of course, other than on my Mac. And even then, that makes me a little skittish, admittedly. But at least it's an option, right? I still have an option of showing my ID, and they match the ID up with the address that's in their poll books, and they look at my picture. Yep, that's him. That's good. And then they could even take my ID and say, "When were you born, sir?" They can do one of those extra questions. Okay, fine. You're good to go. Go vote. Here's your ballot. Go mark it. And for the trans people, and for people who are black and brown, who apparently, according to the Democrats, can't bring their ID because it's discriminatory because they don't have one, and for the homeless, just have them use their fingerprint if they can't get an ID or if they do not want to use their ID. How about that for a solution? And now we know exactly whether or not that person voted and whether or not it was the correct person that voted. People, Chris said, yeah, people that don't have fingers, you're discriminating against them. Toe print. I don't know. Okay. I know. It's just like, but right. We live in this period in American history and world history where technology has advanced to the point that there are easy things that we can do to help people who feel like they are marginalized so that they can still vote in person, which they should be required to vote in person, and still feel that they don't have to reveal their identity if they're trans, number one, and number two, that they don't have to go through the effort, even though the state will pay for their ID, of getting an ID. So it's just a simple fingerprint. So it's either or, not both. And as I said, I think most people would still prefer, especially Republican voters, would still prefer to just show their ID because I think most Republicans are concerned about security. They just assume not have their fingerprint out there. But you see what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? There's always a way to fix this problem. Or we just treat everybody the same, which is everybody has to show an ID. Okay? That's probably the best way. But we have NBC News. And of course, we have not only NBC News, but all of the woke big corporations, NBC, which is Comcast Universal, and ABC and CBS and CNN and MSNBC, who are literally going down this road. And these are the same people who are saying to you that you are an election denier when all you are asking is for elections to be the day of voting and early voting as well, but must be in person, and you must show your voter ID. And then I think you'd have a general consensus with Republicans and most unaffiliated voters, and as well as I'm hoping at least some Democrat voters who would say, yeah, that actually seems reasonable. And in those unique situations where you have that trans voter, then fine, give them some other option but you still need to verify who they are, because they don't get to skirt the law. They don't. They still have to follow the law. Stop asking for everybody to give you a pass with the law. It applies to you too. All laws are supposed to be applied equally. So speaking of the trans community, ladies and gentlemen, Daily Caller is talking about the Texas Latino voters who are now opposing Democrats because of inflation and, get this, trans surgeries for kids. So think about that. The brave new world of the Democrat Party was always going to be about taking over the United States of America by bringing in millions upon millions of Hispanic voters who would then find fealty to the Democrat Party. Except that the Democrat Party has gone so crazy that they've failed to realize that Hispanics are actually social conservatives, because they are. So Latino voters in South Texas told the Daily Caller field reporter Jorge Ventura that they are shifting Republican over the Democrats' out-of-touch stances on economic and cultural issues. The majority of Latino voters interviewed are voting Republican for the first time, voicing concerns over record high inflation and cultural and issues which many have said shifted way too far to the left. Hispanic and Latino support has largely moved to the Republican Party in the past year after Democrats have had a strong hold on that demographic for many decades. I've started to notice that a drastic change in cultural views and on the family values, and then after that, after the Trump presidency ended, we started to see really bad economic changes, said one voter. Hispanic voter, by the way. Quote, even my parents pointed out that Obama's two presidencies, both terms, that is, it was kind of really tough to stay afloat. So isn't that interesting? The Hispanics that have been here long enough to have remembered the Obama presidency, the Trump presidency, and the Biden presidency now have the ability to compare and contrast how well they did in those respective presidencies, and have come to the conclusion that when Obama was in charge, and now when Biden was in charge, or is in charge, if you want to call him in charge, that they actually are doing worse under those presidents than they were under the Republican presidents. Pretty remarkable. Quote, we know things happen that could not have been prevented, another Hispanic voter said regarding the economy. We know that these are because of policies that were put in by people that do not have our best interests in mind. And everybody out here, everybody's really got rent that's going through the roof. So it's pretty fascinating, ladies and gentlemen, because this is a mega move. And it's a mega move, not mega Republican move, but just mega move, because these are individuals that are not just like, they're not changing party affiliation. I'm not going that far, but they are effectively changing who they're voting for, especially when it comes to their principles and their belief that they are probably not in line with where the Democrat Party is today. And so you have to ask yourself the question, how did the Democrat Party mess this up so much, right? They had a stronghold on Hispanics. And somehow they managed to not figure out that Hispanics are family-oriented and religious, and I don't know, that they love their children, and they actually want to have a better life. That's why they came here. I mean, Democrats haven't figured that out. It's so stupid. It's just incredibly stupid. And so we can only hope that the Hispanics come home to the Republican Party, not just this election, but they realize that the best way forward is to stay away from the Marxists who have taken over the Democrat Party, not to mention the lunatics, especially those lunatics who think that your children should actually be told that there are more than two sexes, which is what the Democrats are literally trying to teach children as early as elementary school. I mean, it's just remarkable that anyone would even think that that's possible, but they are. It's exactly what they're doing. And to prove that, in D.C., the nation's capital, public schools hire a controversial consulting company whose job it is to survey the students about their transgender identities. Now, I would just like to know, if your kid came home and told you about this, wouldn't you want to just go in there and punch out the consultants and as well as the teachers? And I know podcast listeners, I'm not advocating violence, but the natural reaction of a protective parent is to say to individuals who engage in this kind of behavior, you are groomers, you're breaking the law, and you better never do that again or else. I mean, that is the natural reaction of a protective parent. It's no different than if your child is going inside of a 7-Eleven and someone approaches your child and tries to hand them pornographic material. Same thing. You're minor, an adult handing your minor child that material. How's this any different? Oh, it's education. District of Columbia Public Schools hired a consulting company owned by the U.S. Attorney General's son-in-law to solicit answers from middle schoolers about their transgender identity, according to an email obtained by the Daily Caller. D.C. Public Schools informed parents via email on October 25 that students will be surveyed during class about their social, emotional learning environment. Part of the survey asks students in grades 6 and beyond to share their transgender and gender non-conforming status. It's okay to ask students what sex they're feeling today, what gender they're feeling today, and to identify themselves. But it's not okay to ask people at the polls, right? Exactly, Chris, for their picture ID because it might reveal themselves. Yeah, and we can't ask the adult, but we can ask the children, the minors. Great point. Part of the survey asks students in grades 6 to share their transgender and gender nonconformity status. As in previous years, the survey asks students in grades 6 to 12 about their gender and sexual identity. The email to the parents reads, "These questions help the district promote equitable treatment for all students in accordance with our transgender and gender nonconforming policy guidance." The email notes that parents can opt out of their child from taking the survey, though it may be administered during class time. So herein lies the game that the public school systems are engaging in. They bring in someone from outside the school system so that you really can't hold the teacher accountable, even though you should. And they do this during class time, instruction time, and they provide the survey, and they're breathing over your shoulder, basically saying, you got to fill the survey out. You got 15 minutes to fill it out. Versus notifying parents via email about the survey and including the survey in the email and saying to the parents, hey, if you want to, it's up to you. You can opt out if you want to, or you can opt in if you want to. Fill out the survey on your own time after school and have your child bring it in or mail it in to us or email it back to us. But no, this is when you know that the school system is losing its mind, because rather than have this done at home where it belongs, where parents can just say, oh, fine, I'm deleting that email, not going to respond. It's always done in the classroom where there aren't parents present, where there's peer pressure, where kids are looking at each other going, hey, what did you put on yours? I'm not really sure what I put on mine. Well, of course, these are sixth graders. They're kids, young kids. So there's all this peer pressure. Oh, I'm going to be cool. I'm going to be, I went to the drag queen happy hour in second grade, so I'm not really sure. It looks like fun to me. I mean, what the hell is going on in D.C. public schools? And what kind of parent would allow this to continue? And why is it that the Justice Department thinks the parents are the terrorists for opposing this nonsense, and that parents are the terrorists for wanting to go there and literally punch out the school administrators for letting this happen? It is a perfectly normal parental human reaction, protective reaction, protecting your children from predators, because these are predators. That's exactly what they are. These firms who are engaging in this predatory behavior on children, the groomers, these are evil people. And the thing is if you try to talk about this on social media, you'll be canceled, or your post will be algorithmed out, or it'll be deleted. Except hopefully on Twitter, we can only hope that Twitter will now start allowing more free speech. And it'll be allowing more free speech, we hope, because Elon Musk is now in charge. And he's gutting Twitter by half of their employees. That's a new article that came out. It was, initially, people thought it was going to be more than that. But it looks like he's going to cut half of the staff at Twitter. And he's going to tell the staff, no more of this, like, you get to work from wherever you want to work. You have to actually start showing up to work. And in some cases, there are some positions, granted, that maybe you could work from home or anywhere. But for the most part, we want you guys showing back up at work. And we want you to show back up at work because it's your job. And we're cutting half the staff. And we're going to stop this woke monitoring of speech and censorship of one party or one point of view. Because, in a free society, it's really okay to disagree. And so Elon Musk is putting that into place, and not a moment too soon, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a moment too soon, because today in the Daily Caller, the Biden administration perverted Trump DHS arm to actually survey Americans. So get this. Efforts to track foreign mis- and disinformation under former President Donald Trump have since been perverted under President Joe Biden to increasingly monitor what Americans say on social media. The former Trump administration official told the Daily Caller. Officials from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was formed in 2018 under the Department of Homeland Security. You know what? There's so many of these departments. This drives me crazy. I mean, when you read the article and you're like, there's a CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and then there's the DHS, and CISA is under DHS. It's like, enough already with all of these agencies. Government is too big. I can understand a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that protects America's cybersecurity from the rest of the world.
NSA.
Yeah, that's like the NSA, right? But there's one new agency after another that's popping up, and then it's a sub-agency of a sub-agency, and it can't be good. It's not good for freedom. So this was started under the DHS in 2018, and it exerted previously unknown levels of direct government influence over American speech on tech platforms, a report from The Intercept found. The crackdown on misinformation has allegedly grown even after the dissolution of the Disinformation Governance Board, which I think we all would agree, the Disinformation Governance Board was never actually dissolved. They said it was dissolved. It was always going to continue in some other fashion. just under some other name, which of course is what's happening. So CISA, FBI, and other government officials, you'll love this. DHS, FBI, CISA, DGB. I mean, it's like the alphabet soup of the federal government spying on you and preventing you from speaking freely, are holding monthly meetings with tech executives. And in the case of Facebook, been given special access to flag posts online. So the deep state, which keeps growing in the alphabet soup of Washington, has been actually given access to flag posts that are being made by citizens of the United States, our free people. You think you should worry a little bit? So Chad Wolf was the former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under Donald Trump. He told the Daily Caller that this report is very concerning and the federal government has no business in monitoring or regulating the protected free speech of Americans. Well, obviously. But what are the consequences of federal agencies engaging in this? Where is the consequence? And this is my question to you, podcast listeners. Certainly, you've heard plenty of people talking on podcasts and the radio saying, well, this is awful. And they're ranting and raving about all of these different federal agencies and sub-agencies that are spying on you and that are censoring you and are teaming up with big tech to really surveil you. But the real question is, what is the consequence to being caught? So they've been caught. Where is the accountability? Why aren't people fired for this? How is it that anybody in the United States of America can partner with Facebook, as an example, as an official government employee? Who cares which department you work for? Doesn't matter. Some officially titled organization within the federal government, and you go to Facebook and you say, I want to have the right to be able to flag posts online and say, it's disinformation, it's misinformation, not true, check here for the actual facts, and at the same time, decide whether or not people get to see it at all. Where is the accountability? And I think the answer is there isn't in modern America. And I think that it demonstrates to us that we may be past the point or even trying to enforce the law, or at this particular point, enforcing the Constitution, which is the ultimate law. We're kind of past it. We're kind of past that point. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is it's really time to just shut these agencies down. When these agencies, or when any agency gets so big and so powerful that any average, everyday individual can't protect their own speech because they don't have the vast resources of these government agencies and of these government employees. When we get to that point, which is where we are today, it means you need to shut down the agencies. So quite frankly, it's probably time, since there is a CISA and the FBI, DHS, who knows where else in the federal government. I'm sure, NSA and maybe other kinds of agencies that we haven't even heard of. The Disinformation Board, which they say has been dissolved, which we know has not been dissolved. It's quite active through these other agencies. I think that might be the play here. I think the play here might be that we have a law on the books that says you're one and done. If you partner with any private firm or even if you try internally as a federal government employee and you're authorized by your department to spy on American citizens simply because you don't like what they're saying, and I'm not talking about terrorists who are threatening terrorism. I'm not talking about people who are inciting others by saying, you know what you need to do? You need to go out and shoot somebody. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people that are just giving their opinion about an issue, like, I don't know, the trans issue. I don't think children should be taught that there are more than two sexes, because there aren't. And I believe that people who try to teach children different identities, that try to confuse them, I believe that's wrong. And then suddenly the FBI gets involved and DHS is like, no, that's terrorist activity. We're going to censor that. So you can't even have a conversation anymore and call out the groomers who are trying to destroy the children of this country, because your own federal government is censoring your speech. And so my point is, it might be time, and it probably is time, to shut down these agencies. So what would that look like? Well, it might look like something as simple as you create a new agency with a very scaled down workforce and scaled down mission. And the mission is really identified and very narrow, and Congress limits that agency to just that function, and that there can be no growth beyond that mission without congressional action. So, fine. Shut down the FBI. Shut the doors, close it, and then right next to it, you have a new agency, and the new agency, instead of let's say having 20,000 agents, has 2,000 agents. And those agents are responsible for doing just a very specific amount of things. And I think Americans would support that, if obviously, filling in the details is kind of important. But I don't think we can fix these other agencies after what Barack Obama has done to them, and after what Joe Biden has done to them, and also after what the actual individuals, many of whom, not all, but many of whom work for those agencies, see their mission as just never ending and just amassing more and more power over you, over your fundamental rights of free speech and movement, and protecting your children and protecting your property. So I'm taking a different tack on this. Others are just ranting and raving. Isn't this awful? No, I'm ranting and raving, but I'm also at the same time saying it is time to shut this down. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.